So it's 2026 and you're not a software developer, but you hear of all the stories of people vibe coding these cool applications over a weekend and getting them working in production. You watch a bunch of YouTube videos of tutorials and all these tools, and all the information is just like a fire hose into you. I mean, you don't know where to start. What I want to do is sit here as a non-developer, non-coding engineer, and I want to walk through a process that I've been kind of continuing to refine over the past couple of years into something that's finally starting to work. We call it project development. Now, I don't know how to code. I've always wanted to code. I've always been interested in technology. But I've never sat down to learn the programming languages, to learn exactly what a project development lifestyle looked like, life cycle looked like. But now that the coding agents are becoming better and better and better, the gap is closing. And it becomes really exciting because my ideas are a lot more attainable. But that doesn't mean that I can just go to a model and tell it to make an app, make no mistakes. And it does that, right? You need to have a process, just like anything. And that process starts with a seed. Before starting any project, you need to be able to decompose your idea into manageable bits that you can explain to the LLM to steer them in the right direction. More often than not, if you have a scattered idea, you feed it to the LLM, and it'll go off in a million different directions. And there'll be parts that you like, but then there'll be many other parts that you don't. Right? And this is what the developers are calling slop. We don't want slop. We want to make our project development lifecycle anti-slop. And that means that we need to be very honest about what we don't know, and then willing to seek solutions to find those answers. So the very beginning of any of my project life cycles starts with an idea and starts with a seed. Now, as I go through this project development, eventually I'm going to show you a use case of a working example on a project that I'm working on currently, and exactly how I've kind of iterated the process and the tools that I use. I won't go into the very specifics, those can be in a different video, but I kind of wanted to just get my ideas out there because I imagine there's plenty of people like me who are non-coding developers who just want to get their ideas out, and they keep running into roadblocks and they keep hearing these solutions that seem very easy, but the problem is it's not. So from step one, what we need to do to avoid slop is we need to slow ourselves down. We've all worked with the chat models, and I'm really a model agnostic. I don't have a favorite model necessarily, but we need to learn how to slow down. One of the ways that we can slow down is, instead of staying in a single model family with our idea, we can use secondary models to kind of red team and to push back, to poke holes in our ideas. This has been extremely useful. So what I'll do is I'll take my idea and I'll distill it down to the absolute foundational units that I know how to describe it. Our example is going to be an electronic medical record, or an EHR, electronic health record. I'm a nurse by trade, and so this is something that I intuitively have a lot of professional experience dealing with the user interface and the user experience side of what current production models have to offer. Okay, but that doesn't mean that I know how an EHR works, right? And so if I wanted to vibe code in EHR, what I would have to do is I would go to the model and I would say, I want to make an EHR, right? But first, help me decompose it. Help me get it down to first principles. Now, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to try and document are actually keywords. And so prompt engineering is an entire subset of category of skills that you're going to have to refine. What prompt engineering was the hot topic, I would say, of 2025, was the idea that the way that we speak to the models can direct exactly the outputs that they give us. When we use token terms like first principles, that means something a lot more weighted to a model than if I were to say, give me the elements, give me the building blocks. Of course, a lot of these things will steer you in the right direction, but there are keywords that seem to get there quicker. Another keyword that I use in my idea phase is primitives. Give me the primitives. I want to build a scaffold for the foundation. Okay, not only does this slow me down, because what I see is the working EHR product. This is what I want. But what you need to tell the model is, this is what I want, but I don't know how to get there. So usually in this phase, step one is, I'll bring this to a single model. I'm going to pull up an example here. Maybe. So this is an example that I started with this morning. Or sorry, this was yesterday. I said, hi, Claude. I need your help brainstorming some decisions I'm making for a project I'm working on. First things first, if you were to break down an EHR or a patient's medical chart to its absolute first principle substrates, what components would it include? This is an intentionally broad question. When I do my planning phase, I usually put the models on adaptive thinking or their thinking modes if they have that option, because then it's going to cause them to kind of go through their thinking process and start to poke holes in their own ideas. Now, as it's working, after it's done, instead of saying, okay, that's great, I did read all this, right? I said, and I've also prompted 3 other AIs with the same exact prompt. You're going to be the head of the council and in charge of the synthesis for final output. Would you like all the outputs one at a time or attached all at once? This is important because you're kind of priming the context of the model to say, hey, by the way, not only are you going to be in charge of the architecting, but I'm also going to ask other people the same questions. Why this is important is single model, one at a time. It gives us a fresh context. and fresh eyes. Each model and their weight are going to have a different approach to the solution. And those different approaches, especially at the broadest level, are going to impact the final output. We want fresh context. Another important lesson from step one is that context poisoning is something that we should be absolutely avoiding. We do not want to poison the context with ideas, with things at the beginning. It's often said that the first prompt is most important because it will spin off the model and influence its weights. And there's some correcting that could be involved. But this is important not only at a single chat context layer, but then exponentially more important when you get into a project. Because the further and further you get along, the further and further away you get from the North Star. And the model thinks it's doing great this entire time. But what you wanted was actually this kind of slow and steady progression. Let's go back to the chat model here. Love this setup. Send me 3 at once, okay? I'll anchor to whichever arrives first, then I'm evaluating the others, getting them as a batch, blah, 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 and it kind of explains. And then I like Claude as my planning architect for this exact reason, because it seems like a buttoned up approach, and inherently the model seems to slow itself down. He's going to treat convergence as evidence, not proof. He's going to take disagreements seriously, preserve his own view when he thinks he's right? So there's confidence. We want the model to be confident. And then ending with what this means for your actual decision. Ultimately, I'm the one steering the project, which is important. So I ended up going to 3 different models. A lot of the times this is overkill, but for this specific idea, I wanted to leverage the ideas of not only Claude, but also Chat, Grok, and Gemini. There's been a lot of work about the, setting system prompts, setting up your actual web-based AI systems to give them personalities. There's a lot of talk about CEOs, and I've played around with all of that, and I haven't really gotten much luck, honestly. I think especially in the web context, which just means when you're pulling up the AI in a web browser, it's best to just have them default. They're already quite good, and then instead of having a broad framework of telling them what you're looking for, you should distill that into your prompts. This way you get a lot more organic feeling, especially if you set up a console like I did. So to kind of go back, I'm just going to spend a little bit more time on here. So Claude is buttoned up. Chat is fast, smart, but very sympathetic. It'll tell you exactly what it thinks you want to know. Right? Grok is extremely nerfed right now. I think it's like 1/5 the size of Opus. I have a lot of confidence in Grok and XAI and what they're going to put out. And so I try to include them in the planning councils. And then Gemini is really fallen off the wagon. But what they leverage is this kind of training off of the broad Google base. Also a lot of research It's kind of what I use it for. Buttoned up planning, fast, iterative, smart. Grok, it's got its own advantages in its architecture. I just consider its outputs nerfed. And then Gemini I use for research. Let's go back to the planning prompt that I ran here. One thing I wanted to highlight, this is extremely interesting, especially with the release of Opus 4.7. It says, one ask when you paste them if you can label which model each came from. Okay, it wants to know because that'll set its own weights, right? And then, or it says or just ABC if you'd rather keep it blind. That helps. And then he corrects himself. Next sentence, right? Blind is actually fine and arguably better, right? So it's almost like he's got this internal wrestling. The model weights want to know because if they know the output is from ChatGPT, that means something to them differently than if they were going to just kind of ingest this broad substrate prompt that I gave them. So I always opt to keep it model blind. I think that's very important. And the reasons I can go deeper a little bit later. So I pasted all three. I had my favorites. I did read all of them. The C was actually ChatGPT's response, and it was the most thorough and kind of fit exactly what I was looking for. A was Grok. And again, you can tell how much shorter it is, but that just relates to the nerfed model. I think it still had fine output. And then B was Gemini, and this was just really bad. So he kind of goes through all of them, where they converge, what he's going to take from each, where he's pushing back, and then a consolidated model. Now, this is important, okay? I didn't prime the model with what project I was working on. Noah RN is a project that I kind of initially started. But there's always going to be priors. The models will start to learn from you, basically, without you telling them. Okay, I didn't tell him, if you will go back to the original prompt, I didn't tell him, hey, I'm working on Noah RN, which is my project. I said, I'm working on a project. It inferred Noah RN. And then you'll see how I continually push back. And this goes back to kind of a good lesson, which I would call to iterative development. It means to move fast and break things. If you get to a point in your project where you don't know what the hell you've created, you have no idea what it does. I think they call it like black code or dark code or something like that. But you know you've had so many turns in the development cycle that you don't know where you started and you don't know where you ended up. The best bet there for iterative development is to just start fresh. What does this mean? This means that you have to be intimately involved in exactly what you're asking for so that you can reconcile the work that you've done, glean all of the gold, I call it mining for gold, and then to start over. Okay? So kind of to make it personal for my project, Noah RN was an agentic nurse harness. This is my one-liner. This is the project. Okay, and then if you notice in my project description, I give it 3 kind of token keywords agentic, which means something, nurse, which means something, and then harness, which means something else. What happened in that life cycle of the development is I kind of knew where I wanted to go. I knew that I wanted it to be a nurse. I knew that I wanted it to chart things. And I knew that I wanted to be connected to resources. And I wanted it to have memory. What else? I wanted it to have a meta harness. And so all of these things are kind of 4 different development areas. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not a developer, so I don't know these things. And so then I start, and I tell the models, just like in this same iterative development cycle, I tell the models what I like. We iterate on it, and then we start to build. And we'll get to the building section later. But ultimately, where I was going with this is that this turned into Mega-Slop. How quickly did it turn into Mega-Slop? In like 3 days. Maybe a little longer, maybe a week. But it got to a point where it's like I would sit down. I don't know what I'm working on anymore. It's all a mess. It's all jumbled. It's all kind of interweaved. There's no providence of what lands where. There's no boundaries. These are all things that I had to learn. And so what do? We go back to the drawing board, okay, and we start a new project. It's called PyRN. Same concepts, right? But now I have the learnings of the slop that I produced, and I can go back to the drawing board. So remember, we're still in the idea seed phase of it. It assumed that we were in the prior project. It has some stuff known, right? And it pulls in these dependencies. I was going to make it a multi-agent orchestration. I was going to use this specific charting dependency. I wanted 4-layer memory, dual personas, a lot of these architectural things that it pulled in, which were the same things that were going to poison the context. Okay, and then this is how I respond. Thanks for the thorough analysis. I appreciate you bringing up the flat check of agent harness, right? But I have since pivoted to a more distilled and primitive iteration of the project to develop without bloat. Okay, primitive, bloat, less dependencies, less pollution. Okay, and then I introduce the project. And exactly the fundamentals that I wanted to work on first. And so if you're in agent development, let's say I want to make an agent. It could be for any work area. It could be as simple as like an OpenClaw agent. The agent lifecycle, this part I'm not concerned about necessarily. I think that the models are going to advance enough in the future where agent development is going to become a lot more plug and play. But there is one dependency I landed on, and that was py.dev. Py.dev is a very, let's say, stripped down coding model, and it doesn't come with a lot of bloat. The system's instructions are very intentionally light. And because of this, I was like, oh, this is exactly the problem that I was running into. And so therefore, my foundations should also have the same principles. And I think we need to look for this everywhere. When we can't find dependencies that don't come without bloat, I think then we build our own. So I'm just going to go back and kind of tease apart some of this. I laid out the very primitive nature of what I was thinking, what the intent was. And then at the end here, I say I wanted to start at the absolute primitives and add complexity only when it is needed. This is a very important concept because the models, like I said, will tend to go off in la la land. It's going to go with or without you, and so we need to slow it down. Right? It answers, reframing changes everything. Right? The core bet. I love this core bet. Right, and then we're going to go into this. Opus 4.7 is very good. It'll give you out models. These are very helpful. So as you can see, my idea was distilled to a very primitive level. What I did then was I brought back this spec here, and I took this spec back to the other models. I'm going to scroll up here. And so I'll paste the spec sheet originally. And then at this point, I start to kind of condense my model use down. So I initially used 4 different agents, and I'll consolidate them into 2 agents. And this is all web still. These are just web chat UIs. We're not getting into the actual coding file system stuff yet, because the files are still ephemeral. They're still changing. It's not quite set in stone. And so recently I've landed on Claude and Chat as my workhorses. Okay. And what they have to offer are 2 very unique perspectives, which when you combine them together, it's far better than a single output every time. So I pasted in the spec, right? And then it synthesizes it, a bunch of tool calls, it's iterating, right? And then it eventually puts out a scaffold. This scaffold ended up being 23 files in a zip, which was massive. And it ended up being a really good scaffold. I brought that scaffold back to Chat. I had Chat iterate on it. And then the next phase after that would be, so they output an artifact, would be to bring it to the CLI. And that we can go through the next cycle. All right, so sorry, that was a lot. I just had to get it all kind of out. So how do we go from project development to iterating on a seed? We have an idea. We decompose the idea. We bring it to the web UI. Ask for primitives. Iterate in console. This is intentionally slow. And the output from that is an artifact. You can call that artifact whatever you want. You can use project management terms or a product requirement document. You can use an architecture, a spec. I could be fundamentally wrong. I don't know how the industry uses these terms. This is how I see it. It's a blueprint. It's a plan. This is specifically what the web UIs are extremely good at. It's just kind of like ephemeral. I'm still ideating. I don't quite know what I want. Teach me what I don't, and then we can go from there. So I hope that you learned kind of a little bit about how I use the different tools to my advantage, and I hope to go into it further. Yeah, and with that, I think I'll end.